Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/historyfangirl. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Kindle, Android, or MP3 player.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Craig. Welcome to the History Fangirl podcast. This is episode 25, The Grand Place. Quick note about this episode recording. The actual episode was recorded in a hotel room in Bangkok, but this intro is being recorded on a cafe on a street in Luang Prabang because it's the only place I can find decent Wi-Fi to upload it. So my apologies, but this background noise should just be at the intro. Welcome to the History Fangirl podcast. Again, this is episode 25, The Grand Place, or as our guest will teach you how to pronounce it correctly, because I do not. It's French, obviously. So where is it? It is in Brussels, Belgium. Brussels is an often overlooked city. Neighboring capitals, Paris and Amsterdam, get far more attention, but Brussels is a dreamy, sleepy city that deserves more. Belgium is so much more than just good beer and chocolate. My guest today is Drew Vahrenkamp, host of the Wonders of the World podcast. We chat about why humble Brussels has a place in his heart, the history of their most famous square, the not so humbly named The Grand Place, and then we break down and start talking about Belgian beer because really, how could you not?
All right, my guest today is Drew Vahrenkamp, host of the Wonders podcast. Hi, Drew.
Hey, how you doing, Stephanie?
Good, how are you?
I am okay.
So you and I host different podcasts, but with the same kind of core idea that the world is full of really, really cool places. So why don't you tell everyone a little bit about your podcast before we get started? Because I think people who listen to this podcast will love your podcast.
I think so, too. I hope so. And vice versa. So my podcast is Wonders of the World. And in it, I use the great places on Earth to tell the story of our people, our civilization, and our planet. So it's a little history, a little travel, and then a little food because you got to eat.
Yeah, you do have a food section, which is...
Yeah, so as an example, you came on actually a couple of episodes ago to talk about Petra in Jordan. So we talked about the history of Petra, history of Jordan and the Nabateans, what it's like to visit the site, other places you can see in Jordan, and then things you can eat while you're there. And so it all kind of fits together in the continuum of world history. So if you like history, if you like travel, if you like to eat, check us out.
Yeah, and I linked to that show a couple weeks ago, but we'll put a link to that episode that I did on Petra with you in the show notes for this one too, so people can find it. If you like the history of places, definitely check it out. Because what I found, and part of why I wanted to make this specific show, was that so many podcasts are narrative focused. And that's really cool if what you want to learn is every single detail of a culture. But if you are on a plane headed to the Tower of London or to Petra or somewhere like that, I don't have time to go through 40 or 180 episodes of a podcast to get to the information that I need for that place. So when I was making this podcast, my vision was, what's the 1 hour of information, 30 minutes of information somebody needs if they're going to go somewhere that is a great backdrop before they actually physically get there and maybe have a tour guide show them around. And for your podcast, you really accomplish that too, which I think is great because as much as I love narrative podcasts, I don't have time to dedicate that much time to one topic. And even though I want to, I'm listening to the History of Southeast Asia podcast right now while I'm traveling around Southeast Asia. And it's great, but I'm only 10 episodes in and he's got 40 episodes already. So I'm going to leave here not having done all of it. But when you get to Southeast Asia, that's exactly the type of episode I could use. But then also your podcast inspires people to want to travel to places, which is part of why I like it. So.
Well, thank you. I'm excited. That Angkor Wat podcast, I don't know when I'm going to get to it, but that Angkor is going to be awesome.
If I tell you that I'm physically going to Angkor Wat tomorrow, are you going to be mad?
I love it. I love that place. It is one of my favorite places on Earth. And I went a little crazy there because the heat and humidity got to me, and I ended up kind of starting to feel like I was Kurtz in the jungle. But it's awesome.
So
and I hope you love it.
Why don't we do this? So part of when I was talking to you about you coming on and like what did you want to talk about? And I know all of this is like a crazy intro. I promise, guys, we're going to get to the topic today. But I was like, I didn't want to be like, oh, let's do Angkor Wat because I didn't know if I could schedule it after I was physically going. But I'm going tomorrow and the next day. So in a couple weeks or sometime down the road, when you have time, let's do another episode and do Angkor Wat.
Okay, done.
All right, cool. So today, though, we're focusing on Brussels, the Grand Place, or Le Grand Place. I have the worst French accent in the world, so
Grand Place.
I don't try.
Grand Place.
I actually really enjoy going to France and then just like saying things the way that I want and having them look at me like I'm a barbarian. So, as someone who also loves the history of places, what interested you in Le Grand Place?
So I'm a massive Belgiophile and or Belgophile. I studied there when I was in business school. I took a semester and studied at the Catholic University of Louvain. So that's based in Leuven, which is this beautiful Gothic French city northeast of Belgium. But as you might know, as your listeners might know, Belgium is split in half linguistically. The north half is Dutch speaking, and the south half is French speaking. And back in the 60s, they decided that they were going to make this split a big deal. So they took the university, which was a French-speaking university in a Dutch-speaking town, and they split it in half. And they took half of it north and left it in this beautiful, Gothic, unbelievably gorgeous town. And they took all the French speakers, the professors, the students, the books, the faculties, the administrators, everybody, and moved them to a brand new little town southeast of Brussels, built in the 60s, just for this university called Louvain-la-Neuve. So when I applied to go study abroad, I thought I was going to the beautiful Gothic one. But I was actually, because I spoke French, I ended up in this crazy, modern, little weird French university town southeast of Brussels. So it's one of the oldest universities in the world in one of the newest cities in Europe. And it was bizarre. But it was just a short train ride to Brussels. So if I needed my fix of history, it's like you go to Europe to study because you want to be in an ancient environment. So I would jump on the train and head for the Grand Place because it's just so gorgeous. So
let's set people up a little bit because I honestly don't know if I knew about the Grand. I'm just going to say the Grand Place like a hick American, but you say it right because you actually know how to say it. This is something Ryan Stitt and I were talking about last week when we were recording it, is like how we just butcher pronunciations. But so I can't remember before I went to Brussels what I knew about it because that was a trip that I took before I was consciously doing travel blogging and travel writing. So I don't remember if I stuck it on my itinerary because it was like on a list of things to do in Belgium or if I knew about it beforehand. But what did you know about it beforehand? And then also, let's tell people kind of like where it is in Brussels.
So it's smack dab in the middle of Brussels. It is the center square of Brussels. And so if you think of, I'm trying to think of other cities, in Madrid, they have the Plaza Mayor, which is like the center square that's surrounded by buildings, and it's beautiful. And a lot of other cities in Europe will have this sort of kind of central market. And that's really what the Grand Place was initially. In fact, in Dutch, it's not called the Grand Place, it's called the Grote Markt, which means big market. And it was just the market square, kind of that square in the middle of town where you do your trading. And I knew nothing. I did nothing about it when I first went to Brussels. I took a train in. I just thought, I'll just go to the middle of downtown and see what I see. And so I didn't have any expectation. And I think that's really what makes it amazing because it's this perfectly composed square surrounded by these townhomes. They're all kind of next to each other, but they're all architecturally unique. They're all 5 stories, and they're of a type architecturally, so there's a unified whole sense to it, and it's just really beautiful. It's just a beautiful place. Like most of Belgium, it's not pretentious. So Belgium is like the least pretentious place in the world. Like they know they're Belgium, right? They're not France. They're not Germany. They're not even Holland. They're Belgium. And they're aware of that. And they're okay with it. And so I love it. And I will always have a love for Belgium as a result, just in my experience there. But that's what makes the Grand Place so cool. Yeah, it's a little touristy, but it doesn't feel pretentious, despite the fact that it could be.
So let's back up a little bit and talk about this city, Brussels, because when I think back to like what I know about Belgium before trying to specifically learn things about Belgium, if that makes sense, you learn about it a little during World War I. Maybe you hear about it a little bit but really, like you say, it's unpretentious. It just doesn't show up in like the big stories of European history that much until you start to seek it out, except when you're really talking about devastating wars. So,
right.
How does Brussels get founded? What is the story of that city?
So the name Brussels comes from the Old Dutch Bruxelles, and it means like home in a swamp. Is basically what it means. Marsh home in a marsh in a swamp. And everything you really need to know about it. It was founded on a little island in the middle of a little bitty river called the Senne. Not the Senne in France that Paris is on, but the Senne, Senne. There's a little river that flows through Belgium and ends up going into the Rhine, I think, in Holland. It was founded in like 979. And it was pretty much a nothing little town. Like it wasn't anything special, except that it was on this little river at the point where you couldn't go upstream anymore, right? Where the river you had to get out of the canoe. And it was also on the road that connected Ghent and Brugge, which were much bigger towns at the time, to Cologne, which was still a major town on the Rhine in Germany. So Cologne was a former Roman colony. So Colonia becomes Cologne. And Bruges and Ghent were like cloth making towns. And they're beautiful as well. But they were still very rich. Because back then, like you forget in the days of today, like clothing is so cheap now, you forget how expensive it was back in the day before you had factories and machines that could make clothes. Everything had to be hand sewn. Even the cloth had to be handcrafted. They didn't have cotton, so they had wool. So you had to weave it, and it was incredibly labor intensive. And most people only had like one or two sets of clothes. Like you just didn't have other options. And so the cloth trade, if you could make cloth, you could be incredibly wealthy. And the trade routes just happened to intersect at Brussels.
So what does the city look like in its kind of early days? And when does it start constructing buildings that are kind of the size and grandeur of the Grand Place?
So early on, it wasn't a lot. It was a trading post, really. And it wasn't until it was owned by the Dukes of Brabant. And Brabant is this kind of central Belgium and the southern part of the Netherlands, of the central part of the Netherlands. So it includes Antwerp, Brussels, Leuven, and Schottenbosch, which is a little town in southern Netherlands. And that's kind of a duchy, part of the Holy Roman Empire, never, ever important in world politics, ever, but very wealthy. And at first, it was just kind of a trading post, and the dukes controlled everything. Like dukes made all the money, and the dukes kept the money. But what changed was, as in many cases in Europe, the Black Death, the plague. Because when the plague hits, it completely reorganizes the economic balance of power. So someone who is a laborer, half of the laborers are dead. And so to get someone to work on making your cloth or selling your good, you have to pay them twice as much now because there's such scarcity of labor. And as a result, now merchants and craftsmen and tradesmen all are starting to become a middle class, which they hadn't been before. And that leads to the guild halls. And they work together as guilds to form so they can keep their professional interests together.
When does the city start taking the shape? It's starting to rise in economic power. When does the Grand Place actually appear, and what does it look like at the beginning?
So it forms around that time, 1300, 1400, right? It becomes really, it had been there, and they had some indoor trading markets. But the notion of a set defined square with the town hall on one side and these houses on the other, that really comes into play in the 1400s. And they build this Gothic town hall that looks like a church, which is, I always think that's cool, right? Because it's this notion of that you only start to see in that 1300s, 1400s of taking church architecture and applying it to a very much not church function.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because if architecture usually, especially back, I mean, even now, architecture, great architecture means that somebody has power and money, right? And maybe today it only means money, but at the time, especially, like the church had power, governments had power. So if you're starting to see great architecture that is associated with commerce, then that means that the people doing commerce have power. Like that is, that is a sign in the city that somebody new is rising, or maybe they've risen, but they're taking their place.
Right. There's an element of that to that, for sure, in Brussels and in the Low Countries in general, which we'll get to in a minute. So the City Hall is still there. It's the only medieval building left on the square. It's really beautiful. It's got like a 93-meter tower. So that's about 28 stories, I think, that kind of just rises up, which is immense. It's just really, it's cool. It kind of feels sort of like Houses of Parliament-y, right? Mm-hmm. On a smaller scale. And other cities like Ghent and Brugge and Antwerp have the same kind of concept. They have this sort of really cool civic architecture to go along with the church architecture. But the rest of the buildings all around were houses, and they all were obliterated in 1695. You talk about devastating wars. So here is this little area, Belgium, Brabant, the middle of Belgium, stuck between France, the Netherlands, and Germany, with England mucking around every once in a while as well. And it's just flat and easy for armies to march up and through and back and forth. And so in the 1690s, Louis XIV, the Sun King of France, goes to war against everybody else. And his mission is to march towards, to fight Holland and Germany. And to do that, they want to go through Brussels. And so they just are assaulting the town. And their goal is to hit the city hall. They want to inflict damage to the buildings, which is the only building they don't destroy, is the one they're aiming at, France. So they destroy all the other buildings. And so now Brussels, the armies move on, and Brussels now is like, all right, we have to rebuild. And so they rebuild from like 1695 to like 1700 with this like fantastic Baroque with little influences of Rococo, I think, and some Gothic homes all around the Place to give it that architectural feel. So they were all built in that same kind of 5-year period. So that's why they have so much consistency.
Okay. So it's planned, but it's not like it was out of necessity and not like somebody just came in and wanted it that way.
Right. Yeah, they had to rebuild. But they what's nice is they rebuilt, but the city had to approve everyone's plans because they're all working together to make sure that they could get it rebuilt in a way that felt right, which is remarkable for the time, right? You don't normally see that level of civic planning in 1695.
Well, especially not in cities that were older, right? Like not, I mean, maybe you see that in like Philadelphia or somewhere new, but not in a city that had been there for a while.
Right.
So let's talk about what are the businesses in the square once it is built? What kind of things are happening in the square? How does Brussels feel about it?
So it's all the buildings. You have like the city hall, and then the other ones are all guild halls primarily. And so, a guild is a group of tradesmen or craftsmen for a particular industry that work together to ensure that they keep prices up, and ensure that they are being paid fairly, and ensure that they keep quality up. Kind of like a labor union in a way. But these were from the Middle Ages originally, and they were very powerful in cities like Brussels or Antwerp or Amsterdam or Copenhagen. So there's a building for the Archers Guild. There's a building for the Boatmen Guild. There's a building for the Brewers Guild. In fact, they still have a brewery museum, a beer museum in that building today. There's a building for the haberdashers, the carpenters. I think there might be a Starbucks now in the Carpenters Guild Hall.
So let's talk about the buildings. I know we've mentioned some of the buildings on the square. Let's kind of go through them specifically. You have really beautiful buildings. You also have places like Victor Hugo's house. So let's kind of go around the square.
On one side, on the south side, you have the city hall, the big Gothic one that I mentioned before. And then across the way from that, you have what's called the Maison du Roi. They call it the king's house. But it wasn't really the king's house because at the time, wasn't really a king. There's only been a king. Belgium's only been a kingdom since 1830. So, in fact, Belgium's only been an independent country since 1830. Before that, it was part of the Netherlands. Before that, it was part of France. Before that, it was part of Austria. Before that, it was part of Spain. Before that, it was part of Burgundy. It's always been owned by somebody else and forgotten, usually, by whoever that is. It's always been an afterthought. So that's kind of a really cool, again, building built around the same time period as the guild houses, but it's much broader. And inside that is the city museum, which has kind of the history of Belgium, as well as a special exhibit that I'll reference later.
Okay.
That's foreshadowing. So those are on two sides, and all the rest of the space is filled in by these guild halls that have had various uses throughout time. Again, they were set up as guild halls. Eventually, they were sold and used as private residences. And over time, they kind of, as you got into the industrial era, they were sort of forgotten, right? They weren't fashionable. They weren't hip. They were sort of kind of left to rot a little bit. And at one point, one of the houses was torn down in the 1850s so they could build like a tramway. It was a horse-drawn tramway then, but it was still a tramway. And that suddenly got everybody up in arms. Like, wait, this is, again, this beautiful part of the city that we're neglecting. Let's fix it. And so at that point, they had a huge preservation and restoration effort to fix it. I think that's when Victor Hugo came by to go check that out. To me, the Karl Marx thing, Karl Marx was in one of these buildings at one point and wrote one of his works. Victor Hugo was there. All of these sort of Belgium likes to do this because they know that you don't know Belgian history, and they're fully aware that no one knows anything about Belgium. They love to reference other people that you may have heard of having been here at one point. It's kind of like a George Washington slept here kind of thing that you find in other parts of America. It's like that. So it's not like, yes, Victor Hugo was here for a while, but really, is it that big a deal? Probably not. Yeah.
So I think of Nijhaven, and I'm butchering this too, but Nijhaven in Copenhagen, where you have the Hans Christian Andersen house, and I kind of think of them as similar. But you bring up a really interesting point because Hans Christian Andersen is a Danish literary figure.
He
and Victor
actually
Hugo
lived
is a
there.
French literary figure, and we're talking about Belgium.
You can see Victor Hugo's house on the Place de Vosges in Paris. That was his actual house, right? This was a place he stayed for 6 months. So it's not quite the same thing.
I want to be so famous one day that my shitty college apartment is got a historical placard in front of it.
Yeah.
So then, what are some famous events that happened in the square, or did famous events happen in the square that are Belgian?
there are two events that happened here, and they both happened before the square became the square that it is today, right? So they both happened in the 1500s. The first one was, the Martin Luther put his 95 Thesis on the door in like 1517, I believe. And 6 years after that, Lutheranism had started to spread and had gained ground in places like Brussels because, as you mentioned, you had civic power had eaten into church power, and it wasn't so resoundingly church focused that they were open to new ideas. But on the other hand, the Spanish controlled the Low Countries at that point, what was Netherlands and Belgium. So
That's this conversation. We took a turn. I just didn't know we were going to be burning people at the stake today.
yeah, and right in the middle of the Grand Place, and that was they were the first official martyrs of Protestantism.
Oh, whoa!
So the first people who were killed anywhere for being Protestants, and not, just like officially killed by the state, right, by the Inquisition.
So, and that's a little bit different than like people like I'm thinking of like
Jan Hus.
Yeah, like and I'm not specifically him. I can't remember if he was or not, but there had been people before that who had been killed, but that it's different because that was like pre the idea of Protestantism even being like a real thing. This is after Luther, after we have started a movement, these are two people that are getting killed for that movement that has a name and an organization. Okay, that makes sense.
And Luther, I think, wrote a hymn about them having been killed. So that was the thing. Then, so that set off, or continued to set off, the wars of religions, right? So the 1500s and the 1600s in Europe were incredibly bloody times between Catholic countries and what became Protestant countries fighting it out. Eventually, Belgium was just a constant battlefield in that, as was Germany. Well, and the other event that happened in the Place was also an execution in 1563. So 40 years after the burning, the Spanish brought in the Inquisition because they wanted to put a stranglehold on Belgium, particularly.
So this is the Spain that is controlled by
Philip II.
Okay, so we have Mary in England, and her husband is Philip II, but he's really the king of Spain. And because Spain controls the Low Countries, he is bringing the Inquisition. My head will never reconcile the fact that like France and Spain are in charge of like the Netherlands and Belgium. Like I know that, I've known that for a very long time. I learned that when I was like 15, but it's weird. It's just like in my brain, it's like two magnets that are like, I don't know why I said magnets because that's not at all what I'm thinking, but like, it's just those two pieces just do not go together in my head whatsoever. So, okay. So Philip II is bringing the Inquisition into Belgium.
Right. It's important because your dissonance is exactly the problem, because culturally the people of the Netherlands and Belgium are incredibly different than the people of Spain, and particularly the Spanish royal family. And so a couple of very Catholic counts in Belgium, they're working with a guy named William of Orange from what became the Netherlands. They were all kind of grouped together as one big group at this point, the Low Countries. They started to protest against King Philip for bringing in the Inquisition. Even though they were very Catholic, they thought this was a negative thing for the rights of the people of the Low Countries. And so he had them arrested and beheaded in the middle of the Grand Place.
And I think most people are probably familiar with the idea of the Inquisition and what it was, but the Inquisition was part of the Spanish church's and state's efforts at counter-reformation, or not necessarily part of the counter-reformation, but just squashing the Reformation and finding heresies. But
yeah, it started against hidden Jews and Muslims in Spain. They started it against they had evicted when Spain was formed, when Ferdinand and Isabella got married and unified Castile and Aragon into one country, Spain. They evicted all of the Jews and Muslims. They said, you have to leave. You got to go. You're out. But a lot of people stayed and just pretended to be Christian, right? And they would, secretly light candles for Shabbat in their basement, kind of thing. But the Inquisition was founded to root them out. But let me finish that thought, right? Which was that the two counts beheaded in the square, set off the War of Dutch Independence, the war that ended up causing the independence of Holland, the Netherlands, because Holland's just one province of the Netherlands, but was precipitated by this, that they hadn't gotten enough people interested in revolting against Spain until this happened, where two very loyal, very Catholic counts were killed just because they criticized Philip II. It got everyone else on board, and that led to an independent Netherlands, which had immense ramifications for the rest of the world.
That's crazy.
And then, weirdly, Belgium ended up being part of Austria after that. So,
of course, naturally. So we've had these two very public, very world consequential executions that happened here. We've had some authors that were really much more important to other societies, and there's no point in mentioning them when you're there. Is there anything else that is important for people to know about the history of the square?
I don't really know from a historical standpoint. The key isn't so much all the amazing things that happened here, more just the beauty of the place, the preservation of it. Because Brussels itself is not nearly as well preserved as other cities in Belgium. There's a lot of Brussels that got redone and has been redone. And some of that's amazing. It's the best city in the world for Art Nouveau, with all the curves and the swirls and things. It's fantastic for that. A lot of old Brussels got bulldozed to build all the European Union stuff when they made Brussels the capital of the EU. But Brussels isn't a beautiful city. It's a workman city. It's a get down to, roll up your sleeves and get to work city. But the Grand Place is beautiful.
I loved it, and I thought it was really beautiful, but it's not beautiful in the way that, like, Paris is beautiful. It's not beautiful for miles. It's like you're in parts that are beautiful. Part of being an American, sometimes you go to Europe and you really appreciate like corners of places that wouldn't make the tourist maps just because they're still so different than the places that you're from. But it isn't like it is not like going to Paris. It is. No. It's kind of going to a city that is kind of a mix between a village, a new city, and an old city.
It is. And it's so small. It's a very important city politically now. It hadn't been. And it's, even as an independent kingdom, the Belgian monarchy did not spend a whole heap load of money to make Brussels the next Paris or the next Vienna, right? So it's not like those places. It, in a way, it kind of reminds me of Philly a little bit.
I love.
And
Philly.
I say that because I do. I love the food in Philly as well. I love the food in Brussels, but it's gritty. There are parts of it that are really cool and really historic and really nice. There are parts of it that are ramshackle. There are parts of it that are modern. It doesn't take itself too seriously, which is important. You're not going there because it's beautiful Europe. You're going there because it's real Europe, and you're going there because it's kind of fun. I mean, it's a silly place intentionally. Their most famous landmark is a fountain of a peeing kid.
Which is amazing. And like also only like 3 feet tall. The best part of it is that they've managed to make a whole tourism industry off of a peeing child. But it's not like the Statue of David size. It is literally the size of a child.
It's the size of a child. Peeing into the fountain. The water pees into the fountain. That museum I mentioned in the Maison du Roi has all of the costumes they have put on this peeing child throughout the years. And you can see all the costumes. When a foreign dignitary comes to Belgium, they often bring a nice new clothes for the peeing child in the national costume of wherever they're from.
Even to like go off of the idea that this child is silly and the city doesn't take itself too seriously, the museum for its most famous artist is Magritte, and while Magritte is amazing art, part of why people love him is because he makes you look at the world and shows you the absurdity of the world, and you have to rethink he doesn't take himself too seriously. So I don't think that's a theme that I had put together when I was there, but now that you're saying that, yeah, like, and you got the waffle.
Their most famous museum is not the Magritte or the Beaux-Arts Museum. It's the comic strip museum. Right? Belgians love comics, right? So the most famous is Tintin, or Tintin, we call it in America. But they did the Smurfs. They did Lucky Luke. There's a whole bunch of comics that they've done. And I think it's because you have a country with two languages. They communicate best with art.
They're not two languages that naturally sound like they should go anywhere near each other.
No, not at all. At all. There's no correlation. It's really weird. And Belgian French was weird to learn because there are a few Dutch words thrown in for no reason. It's bizarre. But comics, because you can draw them and then print the different languages in the bubbles, are really easy to do in a dual language country.
Oh, interesting. I've literally never thought about that before.
They are huge in Belgium. And this museum is amazing with comics from all over the world.
So now that we've kind of talked about the history of this square and how it kind of represents the history of the city in this country that has been not forgotten, but not paid attention to in a way that almost every other Western European country has been. And it's a city that you love so much. What are some other places that people should definitely make sure to check out when they go?
So for me, the magic of Brussels is not the sights. It's just wandering around and eating and drinking. And that's me. I travel. I feel like you best understand a culture by what they eat and drink. And it lets you connect with the locals. So Brussels, the 4 food groups of Belgium are waffles, fries, chocolate, and beer.
And you can get all of those at the same place in the same meal if you want.
You can. Absolutely. I don't know if you should, but you can. And they're all great for walking. Well, beer you can't really walk around with, but everything else is great for walking around. And you can go to a little fry stand over a couple blocks away. Oh, I wouldn't get anything on the Grand Place because the prices are high. Because you have to pay that beautiful site surcharge. But go a couple blocks away and you get amazing fries and waffle with like sugar cubes baked inside and chocolate truffles that just melt in your mouth and the beer. Oh, the beer.
I had that weird crick beer when I was there, like that Belgian cherry crick beer. It's
not weird. It's magical.
It tastes good, but I'm a beer person. Like I like beer, but I'm not like a beer snob. And I knew that I wanted to try it, but I think you have to take like 3 sips before it makes sense to you while you want to drink it and why it's not a problem that you're drinking poison or something. Like it's an acquired taste.
It's not that bad. I was pretty cool on beer before I moved to Belgium, right? I was like, beer's fine. I didn't really care. Living in Belgium fixed me of that because every town has their own brewery. And so in Germany, all the beer follows the Reinheitsgebot, right? The brewery law, which says you can only have 4 ingredients: barley, hops, yeast, and water. That's it. And it's very much the rule. Germany. In Belgium, anything goes. Every town has a different variety. There are countless versions of Belgian beer, and they're all amazing.
So, my favorite beer in the world is a Belgian beer, Chimay Blue. Oh,
yes,
that's my favorite beer in the world.
Monks, they take a vow of silence All they do is make beer.
In the U.S., it's like $10 a beer, and there it's like, I want to say it's like €2 or something.
Oh, I know. Luckily, I had to walk everywhere because I had one of those every day. So able to keep the pounds down because I had to walk everywhere. But Chemin Bleu, so good. So good.
If you're going to go to Belgium, you have to drink beer, and you have to, well, if you drink, you should drink beer, but you should treat it like if you were in France, the way that you would like revere French wine and learn about it and think about it. I mean, you don't have to take it super seriously, but it is an art form there, and it deserves to be appreciated a little bit more than like a Bud Light in St. Louis.
Right.
Not that I have anything against Bud Light in St. Louis. I've been on that tour, but it's I mean, if
it made me sad. That tour made me sad. They talk about how they put rice in the beer, and I'm like, come on, really? One of the beers in Brussels that Brussels specializes in is called Gueuze. It's like Gueuze, like a bunch of U's and E's and Z's. But how they make it is they let the natural yeast come in. So they brew it, leave it in the upstairs of an attic with the windows open, and let the yeast naturally come to ferment the beer.
That sounds like food poisoning.
The alcohol kills the drink. Fine.
It's like if France made wine by just like leaving it in a barrel. Like the thing is that it's like that Italian cheese that has bugs in it. Like when you've been doing something for so long and they know exactly what they need to do, but you would never be allowed to create that as in your method today. Like that's can be a method because it's traditional.
Right.
So anything else that we should know or think about the Grand Place?
I don't know about the Grand Place specifically. I would say Brussels is fun. It's a fun town to explore. Even better, it's so easy to see all of Belgium. And Belgium has a ton of other World Heritage sites. It's got more beautiful little towns than I can count.
So where can listeners find you on all of the various platforms? Because they should definitely check out your show. And we'll link to the Petra episode of your show in the show notes.
So they can go, the website is wonderspodcast.com. And they can find me on Twitter at Wonders Podcast and Facebook at Wonders Podcast. And they can email me as well if they want to at wonderspodcast at Gmail.
I would really like it if everyone would just email you, like, after they go to Belgium, email you pictures of their trip and CC me.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Go and get waffles. And Brussels waffles are different than Liège waffles, and they're also good. And the fries, get them with mayonnaise.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining. This was really fun, and I'm serious. You have to come back and whenever we figure out when it works for everybody and talk about Angkor.
Cool. I'm game.
I want to say thank you again to Drew for coming on the show. If you enjoy this show, you will definitely love his podcast, so check it out. Housekeeping. When this episode posts on Monday, I should be in Hanoi, Vietnam. So if you want to see pictures, live video, which I've been doing a lot more live video of history of different sites as I go, and then a couple videos of just weird things that happen on the road. And then if you want updates for my trip, those go on Facebook. My Facebook page is History Fangirl. Also on Instagram, I tend to put up better edited photos of my trip as I go. And then also Instagram stories are full of just random things that happen throughout the day. So if you like live updates, definitely check out Facebook and Instagram. Again, I'm History Fangirl on both. If you haven't left a review for the show on the podcast app of your choice, it would be phenomenal if you could take a moment, go and write a review and rate the show. I would be forever grateful. Again, my apologies for the background noise on this intro and outro, but thank you so much for listening.